So usually I am a chess coach. I have coached people from ages 6 to 86, usually from absolute beginners. So I've been doing this since I was 16 years old. I'm now 28. So this is the place to be if you want to learn chess from the very, very basics. I've not done a video like this before. I do videos sometimes on YouTube, looking at different checkmates, looking at my students' games, that sort of thing. But I've not ever done a video from the very beginning. Usually I like to have that one-on-one. Most of my students already know how to play by the time they get to watch my videos. So this is the first time I'll be doing a video showing right from the very, very basics of chess what to do. Okay, so I'm going to go piece by piece. If you already know how to do that, if you already know what all the pieces do, maybe wait until this is up on YouTube and skip ahead, I don't know. But I'm just going to be going piece by piece. So I've got my board here, and the first piece I want to look at is the pawn. Okay, so pawns are the soul of chess. So they can move 2 squares on their first go, or they can move 1. So my opponent here can reply just like that. So white always goes first in chess. The player with the white pieces, or if you're playing with colourful pieces, whoever got the lighter pieces, they go first. Now I can choose to move forward 1 square or 2. So I'm going to move forward 2. My opponent moves forward 2. Now, here's where pawns get really weird. They can never go backwards. I cannot move my pieces backwards. But they can take in a weird way. So I can't take straight forward. So I can't take this pawn here. I can't take this pawn in here, cannot take this one. It's not allowed. Pawns can't take face to face. Imagine they've got a great big shield in front of them, a tiny little dagger. They can't stab through that shield to get the one in front of them. They've got to go out to the sides, and that's what they do. So this one is going to capture diagonally, just like that. And this one can take back. So that's how the pawns work. After they've moved forward, they can only ever move 1 square again. So I can't now move this 2 squares. That's not allowed. I can only move it 1 square. Now these aren't good moves that I'm making on the board. They're just to show you how the pawns move. So let's go back at the beginning and let's look at a different piece. So pawns, they move forward 1 square or 2 squares on their first go, and they can take diagonally. Only ever 1 square and only ever diagonally. We'll come back to pawns later, because they're very exciting. The next piece I want to talk about is this one. So this is called a knight. Some people call it the horse, some people call it the horsey, but it's called the knight. I don't really mind, so long as you know how to move it, because it's a very tricky one. So the knight moves 2 squares forward and 1 square across. Just like that. So it moves in a little L shape. So from here, I could go there, I could go there, I could move there, I can move there, or I could go back. Wherever I go, I have to move 2 squares in one direction, then turn a corner and move 1 more square. The horse, the knight, is the only piece that can jump. Nothing else can jump in chess. So it's the only one that can get out before we've moved our pawns. That's why moving our pawns is so important. So if I move my pawn, my opponent moves their pawn, I can get my other pieces out. My knight can jump over the pawns that are in front of it, just like that. So now my knight, one of the squares it could go to is this one here, the one that's got my opponent's pawn on it. So what my opponent's going to do is move their knight to here. And now that pawn has been safely defended, because knights capture in the same way that they move. They're easier than pawns in that way. So if my knight takes here, this one will just take back. And now I've lost my knight. So it's not a very good start for me. Let's go back to the beginning and start again. So what I've learnt about my knight. My knight moves 2 squares, then turns a corner and moves 1 more square. It's the only piece that can jump. Next piece we're going to look at is the bishop. So I've got 2 bishops on my board. I've got one here and I've got one over here as well. So one of my bishops is always on light squares and one of my bishops is always on dark squares. Well, how can that be? Well, bishops, they move diagonally as far as they want. I could move 1 square, or I could move all the way out here. Move there, 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 anywhere in between. I cannot jump. So I can't jump over here, and I can't take my own piece. So my bishop moves diagonally. So I'm going to move my bishop to here. Lovely move. From here, I could go to any one of the squares that are diagonal from here. But we take it in turns, so my opponent's got to go first. My opponent's going to move their bishop, and they can move it to this square. They can move it to any of these squares along this diagonal here. So any of those squares are good squares for, or any of those squares are legal squares for that dark squared bishop. Now it's called a dark squared bishop because if we look, it doesn't matter where this bishop goes, it will only ever be able to land on squares that are light in colour. And this bishop, just the same, will only ever be allowed to land on dark squared bishop, on dark squares. So if a bishop is on dark squares, it will only ever be on dark squares. If a bishop is on light squares, it can only ever be on light squares. So that's the bishop. So we've learnt how to move our knight, our pawn, and our bishop. Our bishop can move diagonally any number of squares, and it captures in the same way that it moves. So that's a bishop. Let's go back to the beginning again. We've messed around too much. Let's go back. So e4, e5. So pawn in front of my king moves 2. Pawn in front of my opponent's king moves 2. I get my knight out. My opponent gets their knight out. I don't take with my knight because I'll lose it when my opponent takes it back. This time I'm going to get my bishop out to here. And my opponent's going to get their bishop out. Next, we're going to learn about the most important piece of them all. So the most important piece of them all is the king. The king is you. You are the king. You've got to keep it safe. And keep the king safe we're going to learn a couple of different things you can do with the king. So the king normally can only ever move one square in any direction. So usually not a very good piece. Can't go far like the bishop, can't jump like the knight, can only go one square at a time. And in fact, I'm going to make some very bad moves now as I show just how slow and rubbish the kings are. They're also very, very vulnerable. So from here, I can start to make threats towards my opponent's king. Well, not quite yet. I move back and say I moved that. My opponent can start to make threats on my king because it's all the way out in the open. Very vulnerable. You see, oh well, okay, I'm gonna go here now. Well, my opponent can start to bring other pieces to attack my king, and I can start to lose space very, very quickly if I don't pay attention. I could get into a lot of trouble here, and so you see my king's getting pushed around because my king is not very good as a piece. Let's go all the way back because that did not go very well. Okay, so let's go back to where the bishops came out. As well as being able to move one square in any direction, the king can make a special move once per game in very special circumstances. So here are the very special circumstances. Number one, the king must not be in danger. When the king is in danger, we call that check. So if my opponent's piece was looking at my king, that's check. And I'd have to get out of check before I did anything else. So condition number one, king must not be in check. Condition number two, the king must not have moved. So we've gone back to before the king moved. The king has not moved. It can make this special move. Condition number three, there must be no pieces between the king and the rook. So here we've got no pieces in these two squares between the king and the rook. Condition number four, the rook must not have moved. So this piece here is called a rook. So I've got one on my badge, and I've got one here. Even got one on my hoodie because my name actually is Rook. So my surname is Torregrossa, which means big rook. So that is my actual name. So I am Rook, and this is my favorite piece. So there can be the rook cannot have moved. So 4 conditions so far. We've got a fifth. None of the squares from where the king is to 2 squares towards the rook must be in danger. So we see if this pawn wasn't here, that bishop could reach that square, and this wouldn't be allowed. But because the pawn's in the way, this square is safe. So none of these squares can be dangerous for that king. And the special move we're going to make is this, that once per game, not only can the king move 2 squares rather than 1, but we can move 2 pieces at the same time. And here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to move my king 2 squares towards the rook. And then the rook jumps over my king. That's called castling. because you want to get your king in a nice, safe castle. And here we've got our tower, and here's our wall of our castle. And the castle is the best place for the king. It's nice and safe. It's not the only way to castle. So if I decided I wanted to castle on the other side, I'd need to involve a different piece. So the other piece I'd need to involve is the queen. Okay, so the queen is very, very powerful. She's the most powerful piece on the board. And she's very valuable. So usually you want to keep her safe, and you don't want to bring her out too early, because it's very dangerous the beginning part of a game of chess, and you don't want to lose your queen. The queen can move in any direction, as many squares as she likes. So from here, she can only go one square, because she can't jump over the knight. So queens can't jump. But now we're clearing out the pieces between this king and this rook. So maybe we can castle the other way. Let's start to move my opponent's pieces out of the way. So I'm going to start moving pieces. So I move my pawn one square. My opponent is going to castle two. So my opponent's king, black one of these, moves two squares, and then the rook jumps over it. I'm going to move my dark squared bishop out to over here to where this knight is. I'm not going to take it just yet. I've got more important things to do. And my opponent is going to move a pawn one square as well. Finally, I'm going to move my other knight out the way. And now we're going to see how to castle the other way. So again, I'm going to move my king. Castling is a special king move. I'm going to move my king two squares towards my rook. Just two. Only two squares. Because we've met all of our conditions. The king is safe. It's not under attack. There are no pieces between the king and the rook. The king has never moved. The rook has never moved. And neither of these two squares are in danger. So let's move the king two squares and see what happens. Not my turn. So first I'm just going to move my opponent's bishop. But now it's my turn. For the YouTube version, all of this stuff's getting edited out, so you really are getting the live experience. So there we go. Let's move the king. You see how the rook has now jumped over the king. Now normally rooks don't jump. Normally rooks are very, very sensible. So they're the last piece we've got to learn about. What I'm going to do is I'm going to clear up this board a little bit, because right now there's a lot of pieces on it. So I'm going to take a lot of the pieces off. And we're going to get to the end of the game. Okay. I'm going to just put a few pieces on this board. And then we're going to learn about the last few rules. Okay. Just say, okay. So in this position, it's black's turn. We've played a whole game, taken lots and lots of pieces, both of us, and now we're at the end of the game. My opponent has a king and a pawn left. I have a pawn, a king, and a rook. Now, if my opponent moved their pawn one square, what could I do? Well, that's easy. I could take it. So if this happens, I take that pawn. So my opponent doesn't want to play just the one square. My opponent is going to try and move past my pawn. But there's a special rule for pawns that only ever happens on this row here. So it only happens when your pawn is on the 5th rank away from where you started. So if your opponent could have moved one square and you would have taken it, but instead they moved 2 squares, you can still take it, as if you took them while they were going past you. And that is called en passant, which means in passing. So it's very, very rare that it comes up, but if your opponent tries to sneak past you by moving 2 squares instead of 1, your pawn, and only your pawn, can take them anyway. And it's only on that move. You can't wait a move and then do it. It's only on that move. So that's a very special move that only comes up very rarely. So my opponent can move their king 1 square in any direction. So I'm going to try and come and get my pawn. What if I don't want them to come and get my pawn? Well, I'm going to move my king to defend my pawn. So now, if this king comes close, it can't actually take the pawn. So I'm going to move my king up here. So I'm guarding all 3 of these squares. That can be very, very important. So my opponent tries to take my white pawn. Not allowed, because the king is already defending it. And you can't move your king into danger. It's not allowed. So instead, the king has to do something else. Can't go to any of these squares either, because these squares are all being looked at by that piece I've not mentioned yet, the rook. Okay, so what is the rook? Why is it looking at all of these squares? Well, let's have a look. The rook can move forwards, backwards, left, right, as far as it wants. So the bishop can move diagonally as many squares as it wants. The rook can move forwards, backwards, left and right, any squares that it wants. And the queen can move diagonally, forwards, backwards, left and right. So these 2 make up one of these. So we've got a rook. That's what we've got right now. So we could move to any one of these squares, or this one. We can move to any one of these squares, or any of these. So because the black king can't put itself in danger, it can't cross this line, because this line is dangerous. So instead, the black king is going to go here. Now, because my king is looking after all of these 3 squares, I'm going to push my pawn 1 more square forward, because pawns move 1 square at a time. And then this king is going to try and chase, but it's too late, because I'm guarding this end square. Now, pawns can only ever move forwards. they're the only pieces that can't move backwards. So what happens when my pawn makes it to the other end? Well, I get to choose what I want. So I get to choose between a queen, a rook, need more hands, don't I? A bishop, or a knight. So now you know how they all move. Which one do you think is best? I'm allowed to choose any of them, but which one is best? Well, I've already said, I'm just going to throw away the knight. It's not the knight. I've already said bishop plus rook together makes one queen. So this is better than the parts combined. Okay? It's like how having a sandwich is better than having bread or whatever you like in your sandwiches. Cheese, maybe. So I'm going to pick a queen. Now, because the queen can move in any direction as far as she wants, this is check. The black king is in check. It's a dangerous place to be. So the black king must move. Black is not allowed to stay in check. So black has two squares that are safe, that are not covered by this queen. So it's the only good squares are here and here. So at random, I'm just going to pick that square there. Okay. Now the aim of the game of chess, when one person wins, it's to get the king in a position where it's check and there's no squares left for the king to go to. So I'm going to move my rook to make that happen. I'm going to move my rook all the way to here. Why here? Well, I noticed that the king could move to this square, and I didn't want the king to move to that square. So I put my rook here, so now king can't go to that square, because the rook controls all of these squares. So now the king can't go there. And if we look at where the queen's looking over here, and down here, and down there, and round there. But we're not worried about that. So now, again, there are only two squares left for the king. So the king moves backwards. Now say I want to trap the king even more. I've noticed that, well, the king can go to this square. I don't want the king to go to this square. So I'm going to move my rook closer. So now my rook controls all these squares and the king can't go there. Now, because the queen is looking at all these squares and all these, there's now only one square left for the king. Because we've got to the edge of the board. No pieces can go off the edge of the board. So the king only has one square left. And so that is where the king must move. So the next move is very special. I'm going to move my queen diagonally to here. It's check. The king is going to be attacked and have nowhere to go. So the king is being attacked by the queen and has nowhere to go. Can't go backwards because the queen's still looking after it. Can't take the queen because the queen and the rook are looking after each other because they can both move side to side. So that is checkmate. Now what if I'd made a mistake? What if, instead of doing checkmate, I had just tried to take away that last square without making check? Well, let's have a look. So now that king only has one last square. What if I try to take it away? Well, without giving check, I can look after that square by moving my queen to here. So now the game is over because the black king is not in check, but it can't go anywhere. This queen is covering every single square that the king could have gone to, including this rook. And the rook is covering that last square. So if a player runs out of moves to make, that's called stalemate, and that's a draw. So you know how to win a game, and now you know how to draw. You know how to move all of the pieces. So you're ready to play a game of chess, in theory. What I would recommend is finding something nice and easy to beat. I suggest playing against a computer, a really easy one on the lowest setting. So any rubbish chess app on the phone would be a good opponent to learn how to move pieces and take pieces. I'm going to put this up on YouTube so you can replay it and watch back later. So if there's anything you're stuck on, you can rewind the video and have a look at it again. One other thing I would recommend that I am going to put in the description when I upload is that Lichess is a free chess website. That's lichess.org, lichess.org. Is a free chess website where you can play through activities to learn how to play chess. But that's everything from me for today. I hope you had a nice time. I'm Sasha, Big Rook, and I hope you enjoy playing chess. Bye!